The camera keeps running even after he sets it down. That's the thing nobody talks about, how the recording doesn't stop just because the person holding it does. Kale had learned that in the first weeks after the Vorath came, watching the feeds from cameras that had been dropped in ditches or propped against rubble, still transmitting, still faithfully logging the world while their operators bled out somewhere off-frame. He'd learned it again 3 days ago when Priya went down in the high pass and the little shoulder mount she'd worn for 12 years kept rolling, capturing the sky and the fir trees and the nothing that came after. He picked it up. That was all. He didn't say anything. He just picked it up and kept walking. My name is Kale Ademi. I'm 41 years old. I've been making this record for 9 years, since the Vorath Compact landed in the Bay Delta and the world as we knew it ended in approximately 6 weeks. There are, by last count, 212 of us left in what used to be the city. I don't know how many are left anywhere else. The Vorath don't allow long-range communication. They allow very little. What they allow is survival, which they call, in the translation our linguists managed before the linguist died, something that roughly means the remainder. We are the remainder. This is what we do with it. Davo Finch was the first person Kale interviewed the morning after Priya's funeral, which had been a small fire behind the old ferry building, and 11 people standing in the rain because 11 was all they could spare. Davo had been a cable car mechanic before. He was 53 now, compact and careful, with hands that had learned to fix things they'd never been designed to fix. He sat across from Kale in the room they used for meetings, a former restaurant, the menus still chalked on a board above the bar, the prices absurd now in a currency that no longer existed, and he looked directly into the lens. "You're going to keep doing this," Davo said, after Priya. Kale didn't answer. The camera answered for him. "Okay," Davo said, "okay." He folded his hands on the table. Outside, the city was quiet in the particular way it had been quiet since the compact. Not empty quiet, occupied quiet. The Vorath didn't make much noise. That was one of the things that had thrown people at first. The invasion that came without sound, without the roar and thunder the old disaster films had promised. They came with a vibration in the chest cavity, a subsonic hum that you felt in your teeth and your sternum and your bowels, and then they were simply present. The way a change in weather is present, suddenly, everywhere, impossible to argue with. "I want to talk about Senna," Davo said. "Go ahead." "She came back yesterday, from the outer district. She's saying there's a settlement out past the old bridge foundations, 40, maybe 50 people. Vorath haven't touched them." Kale held the camera steady. "Why not? That's what I'm asking you. You're the one doing the asking." This was the shape of every conversation now. Questions breeding questions. The Vorath didn't explain themselves, which meant that every piece of information about them had to be deduced, extracted, triangulated from evidence and rumor and the slow accumulation of what they did and didn't do, what they burned and what they spared, what they took and what they left. They had taken almost everything. The power grid on day 3, the water treatment system, though they'd been oddly indifferent to the underlying pipes, so water still ran if you knew where to manually open the valves. The hospitals, emptied systematically over the first month, equipment hauled away on their transport sleds, humming that same low hum that lived in your back teeth. The communication networks, the fuel reserves, the weapons caches, they had left the libraries. Kale had thought about that for 9 years. He still didn't know what it meant. Mira Voss was 22 years old and had been 9 when the compact landed. She had no memory of before that was useful. Birthday parties, a dog, the specific blue of a swimming pool in summer, nothing that helped. What she had instead was the now, which she navigated with a confidence that the older survivors sometimes found unsettling, and Kale found quietly magnificent. She fixed things. Electrical things, mostly, though she'd branched out. She had a workbench in what used to be a bicycle shop on the main drag, where she spent most of her days with her hair tied back and grease on her forearms, and a look of focused irritation that meant she was solving something. Kale brought the camera. "Don't point that at me when I'm working," she said, not looking up. "You're always working. Then you're always going to have a problem." He pointed it at her workbench instead. She was reverse engineering something, a Vorath relay node, palm-sized, the kind they used to triangulate their suppression field. The suppression field was why you couldn't broadcast more than 3 kilometers. The suppression field was why the 212 people in what used to be the city had no reliable idea what was happening beyond the hills. "Where'd you get that?" Kale said. "Found it." Where? Near the outer perimeter. One of theirs must have dropped it. They do that sometimes, drop small components. I don't know if it's careless or deliberate. Maybe they can't tell the difference. What are you doing with it? She looked up then, and there was something in her expression that KL made sure the camera caught. Not excitement, exactly. The thing that comes before excitement when you're trying not to let yourself feel it yet. Trying to understand how they make the signal, she said. If I understand how they make it, maybe I understand how to interrupt it. And if you interrupt it, she went back to the relay node. Then we can talk to the people past the hills. Kale held the camera on her for a long moment. She hummed something while she worked, a low tuneless sound that he recognized after a moment as the fragment of a song. Something her mother had sung, she told him once, back before. The kind of melody that survived in the body even after the mind had let the words go. The council met on Tuesdays, which was a fiction. Nobody kept the day of the week anymore with any precision, but the fiction was useful, so they maintained it. 12 people around a table that had once served brunch. Kale set the camera on a tripod in the corner and let it run while he took notes in the margins of a water-damaged paperback because paper was what they had. The matter before the council was a man named Orrin. Orrin had come back 3 weeks ago after a 2-year absence. Before the absence, he'd been useful. A former paramedic, good with the medical supplies they'd managed to cache in the years immediately post-Campact, steady under pressure. During his absence, according to Senna, who'd encountered him once at the outer perimeter, he'd been operating in ways that were difficult to categorize. Setting fires. Not large fires, not destructive fires, but fires at the edges of things, the abandoned districts, the dry brush on the hillsides. Fires as communication, Senna had suggested. Fires as something else, others had countered. Nobody had a clean answer. He'd come back. He was sitting outside right now, in the rain, waiting. He kept us safe once, said a woman named Cho, who ran the medical rotation and spoke carefully about everything. His hands remember things we can't replace. His hands also burned down the warehouse on 4th, said a man across from her, whose name was Petros and who'd lost food stores in that fire 6 years ago and hadn't stopped counting the cost. That was before, Cho said. He was different then. He was dangerous then, Petros said. He's been alone for 2 years in the outer district. Nobody goes alone in the outer district and comes back the same. Nobody comes back the same from anything. Kale let the camera run and said nothing. This was the discipline of documentation. You let the argument breathe. You didn't shape it. The question, said the woman at the head of the table, whose name was Hazel and who'd been a harbor pilot before and moved through difficult situations with the same focused calm she'd once used to navigate tankers through fog, is what we do. Not what he did, what we do. The rain came in through a window that wouldn't fully close. Somewhere outside, a bicycle bell rang twice, the signal meaning Vorath movement in the eastern sector low priority. We bring him in, Hazel said. We give him conditions. He violates the conditions. We revisit. And if he burns something again, Petros said. Then we revisit, she said again, with a finality that closed the subject like a door. Orrin sat across from Kale in the same chair Davo had used and looked at the camera without flinching. He was lean in a way that was past lean, past the wiry fitness of someone who worked hard and ate simply, into something closer to architectural, as if 2 years in the outer district had stripped everything away that wasn't structural. His eyes were steady. His hands, Kale noticed, were still. You want to know where I was, Orrin said. I want to know whatever you want to tell me. A small sound that might have been a laugh. That's a generous way to ask a pointed question. I'm not trying to judge you. Everyone's trying to judge me. It's fine. I'd judge me. He looked at his hands. I went out because I needed to understand something. About the outer district, about what's happening past the perimeter. What did you find? 3 things. He held up one finger. The Vorath are pulling back. Not fast, not dramatically, but the perimeter has moved inward twice in the last year. I marked the positions, measured them against landmarks. They're contracting. Kale felt something move in his chest. Why? That's the second thing. Another finger. They're sick. Or something like sick. I don't know their biology well enough to be sure. But something's wrong with the ones I've seen in the outer district. They move slower. Their signal equipment is degrading and they're not repairing it as fast. 3 relay nodes completely dark in the eastern hills. Mira found one, Kale said. Orrin looked at him. Did she? She's been working on it. Something moved through his expression. Something complicated, something that resolved finally into something that looked like relief. Then she already knows more than I do, he said. She's always been smarter than everyone gives her credit for. What's the third thing? Cale said. Orrin was quiet for a moment. He looked at the camera, then past it, at something that wasn't in the room. There are more of us, he said. Out past the hills, up the coast, inland, I found 6 separate settlements. The smallest was 20 people. The largest was close to 100. All of them surviving. All of them doing what we're doing. Adapting, learning, figuring it out. And none of them know the others exist, because the suppression field keeps everyone isolated. He lowered his hands to the table. We've been alone for 9 years because we thought we were alone. We're not alone. Cale walked that night to the place they kept the archive. It was a former bank vault in the basement of what had been a branch on Market Street. Combination locked and bone dry and stacked floor to ceiling with hard drives and printed documents, and increasingly handwritten journals. Everything they'd managed to save or record since the compact. 9 years of testimony, 9 years of Cale pointing a camera at people and asking them to explain themselves. He thought about Priya. She'd been the one who'd understood from the beginning what the recording was for. Not evidence, she'd said. Not proof. Something else. When there were millions of us, she'd said. Early on, maybe the first month, we could afford to forget. We forgot constantly, forgot histories, forgot people, forgot what things cost and what things were worth. We had so many of us that we could afford the waste. She'd looked at him across whatever fire they were huddled around. We can't afford that anymore, so we remember. All of it, every voice, every choice. We keep all of it. He'd asked her once what she thought the archive was for, ultimately, who it was for. For whoever comes after, she'd said, and for us right now. So we remember what kind of people we decided to be. He sat in the vault for a while, with the camera in his lap and the drives stacked around him and all those voices sealed in the dark. The conversation with Senna happened 3 days after the council meeting. In the early morning when the mist was still thick and the streets had that particular quality they got sometimes. The quality of a city that had simply been waiting, uncomplaining, for its people to come back. Senna was small and deliberate in the way that people who've spent a lot of time alone become deliberate. Each movement considered, nothing wasted. She'd been making the runs between the city and the outer district for 4 years, establishing the fragile network of contact that kept them from being entirely sealed in by the Vorath perimeter. Tell me about the settlement, Cale said. 43 people. Old warehouse complex, well-maintained. They've got a water system we haven't figured out yet, some kind of gravity-fed thing from the hills. She paused. They've also got kids, real kids born after the compact, 8, 10 years old, running around in a yard. Cale kept the camera steady. There's something about seeing kids, Senna said, who've never known anything else. They're not sad. They don't know to be sad about what they don't have. They're just alive, completely alive. Did they know about us? No. They thought they were it. When I told them about the city, about 200 plus people, the man who runs their council, big guy, former trapper, very practical, he cried. Didn't try to hide it. Just sat down on a crate and cried. What did you feel? She looked at the camera for a moment, thinking it over. I felt like we'd been stupid, she said, for 9 years. All of us, huddled in our corners, not knowing about each other. The Vorath didn't even have to do much to keep us separate. They just had to cut the communication and let us assume the worst. We assumed we were alone, Cale said. We assumed we were alone, she agreed. And we built our whole strategy around that assumption. Every choice we made, how many to let in, how much to share, how far to extend trust, all of it was based on scarcity that wasn't real. She stopped. Or wasn't as real as we thought. Mira cracked the relay node on a Thursday, or what they called Thursday. She came to find Cale at first light, which was something she'd never done before. She was not a morning person, not an early arrival, not someone who sought out other people when the day was young, and the coffee was thin, and the mood was tentative. She came to his door and knocked, and when he opened it, her face was doing the thing it did when she was trying not to let herself feel something prematurely. Come with me, she said. The bicycle shop workbench was covered in components. The relay node itself sat in the center, disassembled into 30 or 40 pieces arranged with a fastidiousness that spoke to how long she'd been up. Around it were notebooks covered in her cramped handwriting, diagrams of signal architecture that meant nothing to Cale, but that had an unmistakable quality of something figured out. The suppression field, she said, not pointing at anything, just talking, which she did when she was thinking out loud and wanted a witness. It's not a blanket. I kept assuming it was a blanket, a general interference pattern they broadcast from multiple relay points to cover the whole area. But it's not. It's more like a web. Specific filaments between specific nodes. Which means, if you cut a filament, you don't bring down the whole web, but you open a gap. She finally looked at him. A gap big enough to broadcast through, if you're close to it, if you know the exact frequency window. How big a gap? 10 kilometers. Maybe 12 if conditions are good. Not enough to reach everywhere. Enough to reach the settlement Senna had found. Enough, possibly, to reach the other settlements Oren had identified. If they triangulated correctly, if they moved relay points of their own to the right positions. Enough. When? Kale said. I need 3 more days to build the transmitter. 4 if Devo can't find the specific gauge wire I need. She picked up a piece of the dismantled node and turned it in her fingers. They're brilliant engineers, she said, and her voice had gone quiet, the way it got when she was being genuinely precise about something. Whatever they are, wherever they came from. The elegance of this. She held up the piece. It's not a military design. It's not built to last or to dominate. It's built to be efficient, to do the minimum necessary. What does that tell you? That they didn't come here to destroy us. She set the piece down. They came here to contain us. There's a difference. Oren's integration into the community was not smooth and was not intended to be. He understood this. He accepted the conditions Hazel laid out with the same calm he'd brought to his return. The same quiet steadiness that Kale was beginning to understand was not detachment, but its opposite. A man who had been alone long enough to know exactly what other people were worth. He worked with Cho on the medical rotation, his paramedic hands remembering what his conscious mind had put down. He was good with the difficult cases, the infections, the bones set wrong, the quiet erosions of long-term malnutrition, and he worked without complaint and without praise-seeking and without the particular neediness that characterized people who were still performing their own redemption. Petros didn't trust him. Petros was honest about not trusting him, which Kale respected. I don't need him to trust me, Oren said, when Kale raised it in front of the camera. I need him to keep an eye on me. That's healthy. If everyone trusted me completely, I'd be worried. Why? Because I'm not sure I'd trust me completely. A pause. I did some things out there I'm not sure how to account for. Not the fires. The fires I understand. They were signals, they were deliberate. Other things, choices. When you're alone that long, decisions get made that are harder to explain to people who weren't there. He looked at the camera. I'm not going to explain them. I'm going to demonstrate something different. That's all I've got. The 4 days Mira needed became 6. On the 5th day, a Vorath patrol came closer to the inner district than any patrol had in 3 years. Not aggressive. They never moved aggressively, which was its own kind of terrifying. But present, that subsonic hum in everyone's teeth, the 3-meter forms moving along the old waterfront with the deliberate indifference of something that doesn't consider you a threat. Kale filmed them from a rooftop. It was the closest he'd been in years. He'd been close in the first weeks, close enough to see what they actually looked like, rather than what the initial news footage had suggested. And the reality had been more disorienting than the terror. They were not monstrous. That was the thing that never made it into the accounts people gave years later, the thing that kept getting simplified into something easier to hold. They were not monstrous. They were wrong. Somehow, built according to a different set of assumptions about what a body was for, what a face communicated, what the relationship between an individual and its environment should be. But the wrongness was the wrongness of deep unfamiliarity, not of malice. The one nearest his rooftop stopped. Kale kept the camera running. He pressed himself back against the parapet and kept the camera running and watched through the viewfinder as the Vorath unit below turned its attention in his direction. Not its face, not its eyes. Some sense organ he'd never been able to identify, and held there for a long moment. Then it moved on. He realized his hands were shaking only after it was gone. On the 6th day, Mira finished the transmitter. It was not impressive to look at. It sat on her workbench like a contradiction. Salvaged components, hand-soldered joints, a power supply cobbled from 3 different battery types. The whole thing no larger than a small suitcase. But she plugged it in and it hummed. A different hum from the Vorath equipment, a human hum, irregular and imperfect and warm. Half the council was there. Davo was there. Oren was there, standing at the back. I'm going to be honest, Mira said, about the chances that this works exactly as planned. How honest? Hazel said. 50-50 on the gap opening. Maybe 60-40. 70-30 if the degraded node in the eastern hills is as dark as Oren thinks. She looked around, and if it works, if the gap opens, we have a window, minutes maybe. They'll detect the interference and push compensatory signal. So whatever we transmit has to be short and has to be specific. What do we transmit? Davo said. Everyone looked at Kale. He hadn't known they would. He'd thought Hazel would answer, or Mira, or Oren who'd seen the settlements. But the camera was in his hands. It was always in his hands. And they were looking at him, and he understood that this was what 9 years of pointing a lens at things had built up to. Not the archive, not the testimony, but this moment, being asked what to say. Our location, he said, and a number, how many we are, and a question, how many are you? The room was quiet. That's it, Petro said. That's everything, Hazel said. They went to the eastern hills at dawn. Mira with the transmitter in a pack, and Kael with the camera, and Davo and Oren as escorts because the outer district was still uncertain. Senna was already there when they arrived. She'd gone ahead to scout the route, old habit, and she led them to the high point Mira had identified, a clearing that had a clear line of sight to where the dark relay node sat on its pole, silent and degraded, no longer singing its piece of the suppression web. The city was below them, small and stubborn in the early light. Kale filmed it. He filmed Mira unpacking the transmitter with steady hands, Davo holding components without being asked because he understood equipment. He filmed Oren standing at the edge of the clearing, looking out at the hills, and the hills looking back, and the long particular silence of the world that was. Ready, Mira said. Do it, Hazel said over the radio. Mira powered the transmitter. For a moment, nothing happened. The hum of her cobbled-together machine, and the hum of the world, and the distant subsonic presence of the Varath web, and nothing, no gap, no shift, no sign of anything other than the patient resistance of systems designed by minds that had solved these problems for centuries. Then the relay node above them flickered. Kale saw it, a single pulse, like a power surge, like a catch in a breath, and Mira's equipment changed pitch, and she said quietly, "There," and her hands moved. The broadcast was 22 seconds. Their location, given in landmarks, the bay, the bridge foundations, the hill with the tower. Their number, 212. And the question, sent out into the gap in the web, into the space the dead relay node had opened, into whatever lay past the hills. How many are you? Then the gap closed. The relay node steadied. The web reasserted. The suppression field settled back over the hills like weather. They stood in the clearing and said nothing. Did it go? Davo said. It went somewhere, Mira said. She was looking at her equipment with the careful attention of someone who didn't want to say more than they knew. They walked back down to the city and waited. The answer came 11 days later. It came through Senna, who came through the outer district at a run, which was not something Senna did. Senna was methodical and paced, a woman who had calculated the metabolic cost of urgency and decided it was rarely worth paying. She came through at a run, with a handheld radio that shouldn't have been working, and a look on her face that Kael had never seen there before. Someone answered, she said. The radio was patched through a relay point that Oren's information had helped them establish in the eastern hills. A fragile link that lasted minutes at a time, through gaps in the suppression field, that Mira was now mapping with the precision of a surveyor. The voice that came through was clear despite the interference. A woman's voice, older, steady, not frightened. She said they were 117. She said there was a settlement north of them with 90. She said there was a community in the eastern valley she'd had contact with twice. She didn't know their number. She said she had been transmitting for 3 years with no response and had begun to think there was no one left to hear. Kale held the camera. Cho put her face in her hands, not from grief. Petros, standing in the back of the room, looked at the floor with an expression that took Kale a moment to identify as shame. The shame of having closed ranks for so long around a scarcity that was less absolute than they'd believed. Oren, standing beside Kale, said nothing. His face said enough. Over the next 4 days, 3 more responses came through. Fragments, interrupted by the suppression field reasserting itself. Conversations held in 30-second windows through gaps that Mira tracked and predicted and exploited with a ruthlessness that Kale found deeply admiring. The numbers added up slowly, imprecisely, through broken transmissions and third-hand relays. 400 here, perhaps 200 there, a cluster of small settlements in the northern hills that might total 300, more than 1,000 people, possibly more than 2,000 if the estimates were conservative. 9 years of isolation, 9 years of making choices based on scarcity, 9 years of an assumption. We are alone. We are the last. The Vorath have taken everything. That turned out to be, if not false, then radically incomplete. Kale set the camera on its tripod in the council room and sat down in front of it. He'd never done this. He was always behind the camera, never in front. It felt wrong, technically. Felt like the image was too close, the focal length too short, like the perspective was off. He made himself sit still. "I'm going to try to say what this means," he said. He stopped. He tried again. When the Vorath came, the first thing we lost was scale. We went from 7 billion down to something no one could count, and what that did, what that really did, beyond the grief, beyond the loss, was make us small, made us think small. We stopped being a civilization and started being a village. And villages are about survival. Villages make sense of survival. He looked at the lens. But there's something villages lose. Villages start to think the horizon is the edge of the world. The room was empty around him. He could hear the city outside. Quiet, that same occupied quiet. That Vorath-present hum in the distance. Mira's transmitter was 22 seconds. Oren spent 2 years in the outer district. Senna's been running back and forth for 4 years through territory that should have killed her 3 times. And none of that would have added up to anything without everyone sitting in front of this camera for 9 years and saying what they knew, what they felt, what they'd lost, and what they'd held on to. He paused. Priya knew that. That's what the archive is. Not a history, a reminder. This is what we know. This is who we are. This is how many of us there are. He reached forward and stopped the recording. Then he started it again. "One more thing," he said. "The Vorath are contracting." Oren saw it. Mira's measurements confirm it. The perimeter has moved 3 times in the last 60 days. The suppression nodes are degrading and not being replaced at the rate they were. Something is changing in how they're operating, or in their capacity to operate. We don't know what it means. We're going to find out. He looked into the lens. We have, by current count and best estimate, somewhere between 1,200 and 2,000 people in a radius of 40 kilometers. We have an engineer who understands how the suppression field works and is learning more every day. We have a network of travelers who know the outer district. We have a paramedic with 9 years of stored knowledge in his hands. We have a harbor pilot who makes decisions like she's bringing a tanker through fog, careful, confident, and aware of exactly how much room she has to work with. He let that sit for a moment. The Vorath came here and they did what they did, and they've been doing it for 9 years. And we've been doing what we've been doing for 9 years. And it turns out that what we've been doing is surviving until we could figure out the next thing. That's not a plan. It's barely a strategy. But it's what we are. We figure out the next thing, and then the thing after that, and somewhere in the middle of all that figuring, we call at each other. We sit around a table and argue about it. We hum songs we half remember and fix things with components that were never designed to go together. And we keep the camera running even after the person holding it has gone. He stopped. We keep the camera running. Outside, a bicycle bell rang. Once, nothing urgent, just a signal, one person to another, cutting across the distance between them. He left the camera running. It recorded the empty room for a while after he'd gone, the light changing slowly as the morning came in through the high windows. The sound of the city outside, doing what it did, existing, persisting, making the small, steady sounds of people who intended to remain. Somewhere in the eastern hills, Mira was at a relay point, mapping the gaps in the suppression web with instruments she'd built from things the Vorath had left behind. Somewhere in the outer district, Senna was moving toward the settlement she'd found, carrying a radio, carrying the number 212, carrying the question and its answer. In the medical room down the corridor, Oren's hands were doing what they knew how to do. The camera recorded it all. The light moved. The city breathed. 212 people, and then more, and then more. The remainder, remaining.